and affect us. So, as Chrisi mentioned, the treasurer is the chief investment officer for the state of Illinois. The state at any given time has about $8 or $9 billion in what you would consider kind of available cash on hand. Cities and counties around the state have about the same amount, another $8 or $9 billion at any given time that they invest through the treasurer's office. And so on an annual basis, the treasurer is responsible for about $17 billion in investments. That is not necessarily programmatic money. It's really just managed as sort of a big checking account, for lack of a better term. But you have to invest it very carefully. You have to make sure that it generates a solid and steady return, 3, 4, 5%, somewhere in there. And then with those returns, you administer a series of programs to help businesses grow, people buy a home, and so forth. And again, in this economic climate, I think it's particularly critical that those programs work well, because everybody needs capital to either start or sustain a business. Now, there are some additional functions that the treasurer has which are critically important. One that I'm sure everybody here is familiar with and may be personally affected by is the Bright Start College Savings Program. And this is a program in which people can invest for their kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews through the treasurer's office, so that as those college savings grow, they grow tax-free. That's why you would invest with your treasurer. Your treasurer is not a competitor to Charles Schwab or your stockbroker. It's because you're investing through the government, and therefore the funds can grow tax-free. Well, the current treasurer's office, which includes my opponent, who's the chief of staff there, decided to change the way that college savings money was invested. They put the money into derivatives and mortgage-backed securities in late 2007, early 2008. So we're talking about 2007 earlier. And if you don't know where the story ends up, you can figure it out. The funds took a dive. They lost 40% of their value overnight. And if your kids are young, you might be able to make the money back by the time you guys are probably going to, what, Harvard and Stanford?
Probably.
Anyway, you can make the money back. But when your kids are 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, you lose 40% overnight. You can't go to college. And we're in a crisis in higher education in Illinois anyway. The U of I is furloughing professors and hoping that people don't take furlough days when there's a classroom full of kids. We know the state hands out MAP grants for college, which are underfunded, almost got canceled this year until the very last minute. And so you literally have tens of thousands of families all over the state who cannot afford to go to college. And what's even more troubling is that when we asked, we were told the loss was $85 million and there was going to be a lawsuit. We'd recover $77 million. We'd get 90% of the money back. We found out right before Christmas the loss was $150 million. That's a big discrepancy. And we said, well, why? Why was there a cover-up? What's the real number? And they said, well, we lost $85 million over 9 months, but the losses spanned 13 months. And so they really were $150 million. Well, everybody here who follows state government, that'd be like me saying, well, it's no big deal. We only have a $1 billion state budget deficit every single month. You can't have it both ways. So that is an area where the treasurer really has to represent families. You have earned people's trust. You're investing through your state government, and it's particularly critical. So obviously, Bright Start needs to be overhauled. That will be something we start on the first day we take office if we win. Let me talk, though, about what the other major areas of focus for the campaign. We obviously are focused on job creation. That is the #1 issue on people's minds as we travel around the state. And I think it's pretty clear that if we're going to create jobs in Illinois, private sector is going to have to do it. When we have a state government as broke as ours, and we have city and county governments around the state as broke as they are, new jobs, at least in any meaningful number, will not be created by government. They'll be created by the private sector. And again, we're at 10% unemployment. We need to get that down 9, 8, 7, down to 3 or 4% at least. And when you couple that with the fact that the state treasurer is the state official that deals with the financial sector more than any other, it's not a leap to say that your treasurer should be focused on jobs. And so we have been pumping out press releases at the clip of about 2 or 3 a week, talking about all the great ideas we think they're great that we have to try to use the treasurer's office to stimulate and bring private sector investment into the state to create jobs. Now, I've spent most of my career in the transportation industry. The transportation industry is suffering financially, but it's also an incredible job creation machine, particularly because those jobs typically can't be outsourced. They have to be wherever the transportation modes are. And so we've been spending a lot of time on high-speed rail, which is something I know a lot about. We did a a roundtable on jobs with labor folks, economic development officials, urban planning people, local elected officials in Rockford last week. Got a great response from the communities. You can imagine Rockford's got the highest unemployment rate in the state. And there are a lot of things that the treasurer can do to bring investors here. I think we were talking about it earlier. We have to identify specific opportunities and say to investors, we have a great state. We've got great cities and towns, great kids, great schools. You need to come here and put your money to work. And one of the things that the treasurer can do, as I mentioned earlier, is invest alongside the private sector. And I think when investors see that the government's willing to put some money on the table, they will come in spades, and we can do that without increasing the deficit or raising taxes. Now, we can't, we're not going to sell moonshine. It's got to be concrete examples. But as I travel the state and find these examples, I turn around and ask local elected officials, economic development folks, union locals where 45% of the people are out of work, what are your statewide elected officials doing to help? And I typically get blank stares. The answer is nothing. So we may not succeed, but we are certainly going to try. I'm working too hard to be treasurer and not to try to do everything I can with the job. Now, one other thing I'll just mention quickly is obviously another thing that impinges on our ability to attract investors is our reputation for corruption. And we'll never know how many people decided to skip Illinois because they thought it was a corrupt pay-to-play state and they didn't want to buy off crooked politicians. The state treasurer does not control reform legislation. I think we would all agree even the governor doesn't control it. That's really the speaker. But I think as one of only 6 independent statewide elected officials, you can and must lead by example. The treasurer's office operates under separate rules for campaign finance, which makes sense, again, because you got $17 billion under your jurisdiction. I looked at the rules. I didn't think they were anywhere near adequate. Loopholes you could drive a truck through, which is sort of an Illinois tradition. So in November, I put my own rules in place, and I restricted who I could take money from beyond what the law requires. That's not a fun thing as a candidate because you want to be adding donors to your list, not taking donors off. But I want to be able to say to my supporters, we're changing Illinois politics now, and I want to have some moral authority when I walk in the room with investors to say, I am an Illinois politician, but we're running an honest office, and we want you to come here and invest. So that is a critical part of the campaign, but also a critical part of the sales pitch that I want to make for our state when I'm trying to bring investors here. I have spent most of my career in the private sector. I have my own firm today that works with small transportation companies trying to help raise capital. Very difficult for our clients. Very hard to find investors willing to invest in this climate. It's been that way for 18 months or longer. But we're pushing ahead. I did spend 4.5 years in the federal government. Went to work for Secretary Mineta, who you may remember was Secretary of Transportation. He was the only Democrat in the cabinet at the time. Did a study for him of Amtrak and high-speed rail. Bush administration shelved it because they didn't believe in public transportation, which is a small problem. But we now finally have a president who does, and so that has turned out to be very relevant experience. But I was there on 9/11, and after 9/11, helped set up the Transportation Security Administration in a conference room about half the size of this store with 2 other people, and in 13 months, we built the agency from scratch. We hired 60,000 people, all the screeners that we know and love at the airport. And at our peak rate, we're hiring about 5,000 people a week. Steve Balin, who's there in the gray sweater, is my roommate from college. I was employee number 3. He was employee number 8. And so we've been through the trenches, and he's sleeping on the floor for the last 3 weeks of the election to help us get home. Good. And that's what college roommates do, and obviously he's not getting paid to do it. But anyway, we built this agency literally from scratch. Then in 2003, we moved over to the Department of Homeland Security. I took over a small operation that by the time I left 2.5 years later was $150 million a year, even bigger than the state treasurer's office. I was responsible for all the programs we had to identify potential terrorist threats working in transportation. And it was very much a hot seat job. I was testifying in Congress and battling back and forth with the White House for resources. Press was covering what we were doing. Labor and trade groups and privacy groups were very interested. And obviously government needs to run more effectively, but government's not a business. It's not intended to be run like a business, and I think you need both public and private sector experience, particularly for the treasurer's job. So anyway, as I mentioned, we are at the very tail end of a 9-month effort. It's been great. I appreciate everybody coming today. We need your help on February 2nd. If you're willing to make phone calls, we're trying to call 25,000 voters statewide before the end. If anybody is willing to write a check. We are obviously collecting every last penny we can. Our media campaign starts tomorrow, and it will be a blitz for the last 2.5 weeks of the race. And obviously, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments anybody has. But thank you again for coming in. John Langford with the clipboard is the field director. He also will take your money, I guess, too. But if you want to help, please see John before you go, and we'll follow up with you and get you signed up. Anyway, if anybody has any questions or comments and complaints, because candidates are a funnel for complaints, even though